And there's much still to be done, I think, with native cloud and moving applications to the cloud. So that's going to be the topic of our panel discussion today. We're going to talk about the journey of how do you bring your application to a native cloud application, looking at the well-architected framework, and also coming back to this question that's clearly of interest to the audience here in terms of cloud costs, security, and also maybe a little bit on how do you choose between the different providers. So I'm joined on stage by John Tallon, Director of Modern Apps from Storm Technologies. John's worked with many customers in terms of helping them migrate their applications to cloud and building new cloud services. Also, Alan Harney from Fidelity, who's responsible for cloud provider enablement and their chapter lead with more than 10 years experience working in enterprise cloud computing. And you see we've brought back some of our speakers as well from this morning. Welcome back, Todd, and Paddy has joined us as well, and David, I think is going to join us. The way we're going to do this is we're going to get a short presentation from John and Alan, and that will kind of set the scene. Then we'll get into panel discussion. But we want to mix that up with your questions as well. We'll make sure we get to your questions and then we get you out of here at 5 o'clock. So without further ado, let me hand you over to John, and he's going to take us through the well-architected framework and talk about landing zones.
Thanks, Eric. So I've only about 40 slides to go. Everyone can hear me okay? So yeah, as Eric has said, I work with Storm Technology, so we help a lot of customers on their journey to the cloud. We also help a lot of customers in terms of education on the cloud. And I thought what I'd do is I'd share some of the examples. I've heard a lot of good topics already covered, so which means that I can actually nip out a little bit of content that I was going to talk about, which is great, right, for you guys. But one of the things that I always see coming up is the security side, right? So I did ask ChatGPT, just the top 5, and this is what it gave me back. And I did fact check them, and they're pretty much accurate enough, right? But these are the common threats that we would see our clients, but also most organizations would be looking at in terms of what do you need to protect about, because once you bring it across the boundary into the cloud, you've got a whole different raft of potential worries that you need to, as an organization, mitigate against. Data breaches, I'm not going to go through each one of them in detail, but data breaches is a main one. And again, we see most of that's compromised through some sort of a malware attack as well. Thankfully, our cloud providers do already a good job on denial of service attacks and trying to mitigate against that. So, but these are kind of very common to what we see as well with our customers. And one for the developers is really around how do you secure your APIs. And most applications, as we know, are driven through some sort of APIs for obvious reasons, integration and other things like that. Now, thankfully, there's a lot of good learnings out there, which all clouds provide, right? I'm going to talk about Microsoft's Azure. Didn't get enough clout today, so maybe I'll give it a bit of that. But security is very much a learned, and it's a journey that most organizations will come on, and it's well documented in these well-architected frameworks, which we've seen Liberty talk about and we've heard already mentioned a couple of different times. That well-architected framework is going to be reference to architectures, it's also going to be learnings, it's also going to be tooling, and it's going to help you try and develop a center within your organizations of how you can address common problems that are experienced, and then build upon that. I'm not going to go through the well-arch because the guys from Liberty IT kind of went through a lot of the spokes of that. But even just down on the security side, that's kind of what I want to zone in on, because that's, again, it's part of the learning journey that we're trying to help our clients with. We talk a lot about with our clients, and we heard this a lot about the digital transformation. We've all heard it, and definitely around COVID, it was accelerated, right? And as part of that, security has to be re-examined in the context of how we looked at security in the past, and now how we're looking at security with SaaS tools and cloud platforms. So those security models need to change. Digital transformation is all around agility and being able to adapt really fast. And of course, cloud helps you do that with all the tooling we've seen before. So we do need a different security model for that. And that security model or approach is very akin to zero trust, or least privilege required. So what the three key aspects of zero trust is like verify explicitly, use the least privilege access where possible, and then always assume breach. So if your development team and your operations team are working on that premise of always assume breach, then you're going to be looking at your software development practices in a different way that you can try and make your applications more secure. Now that's a lot of education depending on the tool, and also, but it brings it back down to that shift left examples that we've been talking about earlier. Is bring it back into the developers potentially as far down that chain as you can. So what is zero trust? This is a slide courtesy of Microsoft, right? But it does dictate exactly what it is. And what I want to talk about is how zero trust then can lead into your journey into the cloud in the next, just in the next couple of slides after that. So if you look at the center there, we've got zero trust and you've got policy enforcement. And that's a really critical part. So once you define your policies, and there are a lot of benchmarks out there that you can use from the different cloud providers, then you need a way to then force them down or apply those policies right through all of your estate up in the cloud. And obviously they can reach back to your on-premise state as well. But there's 6 key elements of that. They're on the left, and identity is a key one. So identity obviously is who's using your applications. Are they who they are? MFA, we saw from Nick earlier on that MFA or not being there was a big problem. So do we trust the identity, and also how can we ensure that identity is maintained across using that least privilege? So that's right through to your data. How do you secure it at rest? Can we enforce a policy that makes sure anytime data is stored and in transit that we've got it encrypted? I won't go through all of the various items there, but that's a key aspect of the zero trust element. So as you start your journey on the cloud, you've got to start thinking like that. And sometimes it's a slight change for your operations team if they've been siloed in the past. And that kind of bakes into your landing zones, right? So I'm not sure if anyone's heard of landing zones before, hands up. No, okay. I'm sure it'll make a bit more sense. So landing zone is not just unique to Azure, but this is an example of an Azure one, where you're using some top-down approach to enforce those policies that you would have seen or that you've got available to you. So they could be SOC policies, they could be 27001 policies, they can be just average standard cloud best practice policies. And you can organize your tenants, your tenant and each subscription, it could be account in AWS, in a way that you can apply those policies and you get more consistency around how you design your applications in the cloud. Now, this is a key topic. We work with a lot of public sector as well, and this is a really, really good starting point for them as they start to embrace the cloud. Obviously, they've probably been last into the cloud in some respect over private sector, sorry. But getting these landing zones defined and baking in that zero trust approach into that really helps them with the confidence that they're not making the wrong choice of moving into the cloud. So this is a really key education part. I do have a diagram of an application. This is not the exact one for obvious reasons. I want to share all of the data. The IP addresses are not the same. I'm not going to go through it in detail just in the interest of time, right? But I will just kind of just talk about 2 key parts of it. If you look here in the middle, we've got this connectivity. It's a subscription. That's called so this is what's called a hub and spoke architecture for a landing zone. So all of the on-prem for this particular client is going to be going through a circuit, a very secure VPN tunnel, effectively up into the cloud. So back up into here, and that's routed through there. And again, going back to that zero trust, not new to networking, but the first thing that we've done here is we've made sure that all of the resources that have to be accessed through here will be accessed through a certain hub, which is going to allow connectivity then to the rest of the applications. So each one of these then will apply its own concept or baseline or configuration that will apply some sort of a trust model as transactions come out. One obviously being the secure VPN tunnel from on-prem up into the cloud. And that means that people have to be connected to that on-prem network before they can even access the cloud-based resources. So that's security by design. And again, if we Go forward over here, there's a couple of different other services or hubs, and these are used for monitoring. We've seen about monitoring your estate in there. So how do I know when something is kind of deviated from what it should have? We have an specific identity hub here, which we've put in things like DNS services and domain controllers and other aspects like that. So we're segregating everything else, and we're applying different security policies and benchmarks based upon what should be done, and also based on best practices. But the meat and two veg of this actual, we'll say, infrastructure here is the application, which is circled there on the right-hand side, is that that's really what the workload, which is where the application is running. So there's but in order to get to the services running out, in fact, it's AKS running on most of that, but in order to get to that, it's got to go through the gate. It's got to be attached to the on-prem network first of all, through the VPN circuit, up into the gateway, and each step of those is applying the different policies. This is not new, by the way. There's lots of different reference architectures out there that you can adopt. But we felt that the landing zone was a really good way to start off to get your heads around how do I need to think about security and my approach to the cloud, assuming that you've got the tools and all of the how you're going to build the application decided. The last part I'm going to finish on is just talking. Now, this is an Azure slide, right? But there's three key parts here. I just want to make sure that everybody understands. So, like, security is not, you're not finished with security ever, right? And it's going to affect every different part of your application depending on where. But there's three key kind of cycles you're going to always be in. It's like, how do I secure and protect? So that could be at the start of my first deployment. It could be continuous, right? How do I detect if there's a deviation of that? The cloud itself has a responsibility to tell me when something's happened, but also what can I do to ensure that I can know about issues as soon as they arrive? So lots of examples of the alerting that comes out of, say, AWS. Azure's got similar, and of course Google. And then how can I investigate and then remediate that, and who's responsible for that? So if I've got an identity issue, who gets that alert? Have they got the information? Have they got tools to assess what they need to do? And then how do they bake that back into the pipeline so it gets deployed? So if it's a configuration that needs to be changed, or MFA hasn't been turned on for an account, or conditional access policies need to be updated, or something like that, who does that? So that becomes a cycle, and that becomes part of the journey of learning in your team as well. And where do you find this information? In the context of Azure, and this is the last slide I'll talk about, but in the context of Azure, there's a Defender for Cloud service. There's equivalent in Google and AWS, and there's three control domains that's kind of really looking out for. And you can see there, it's kind of lit up with red and yellow depending on what's happening there. And this will alert it directly into your inbox, or push notifications and all that kind of stuff into the right teams. So what happens if there's a deviation, or if I've deployed something into that landing zone diagram that I've showed you earlier on, and it doesn't meet the criteria, it'll show up here as a red. And I'll find the information. It could be a false positive, but I know what to do, and I can drill down into the information here, and I can take an action. And as you can see there as well, there's SOC, just where the highlighted tabs, there's lots of different other policies and procedures, policies that you can apply based upon the compliance standards that you need to adopt. Obviously, SOC and others for fintech could be key ones, and we've heard of that already. So that's kind of a quick whistle-stop tour of the landing zones and how Zero Trust kind of feeds into that. So what I'll do is I'll probably hand over to Alan, and I'll take a seat for the questions and answer sections that are okay.
Thank you, John.
No problem.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to go through this. I have only 3 or 4 slides, so I won't take up too much of your time before we get to the kind of questions and answers stage. My name's Alan Harney. I work in Fidelity Investments, and I'm a chapter lead there working in cloud and platform engineering. I've been in Fidelity for 12 years, but over the last 6 years I've been working in the cloud space, and probably over the last 4 to 5 years we've been really aggressively moving towards the cloud. And similar to Liberty's story earlier, we're about 60% along that journey, and probably about 3 years ago we had agreed that we would be at 70% by 2023, so we're well on that way. We hope to be about 95% by 2026, so we're definitely making some great strides there. I'm going to talk a little bit today, just to give some context, about some of the learnings that we've had along the way, I'm going to share about that, and if you want to ask any questions during the panel to go a little bit deeper into that, I'll be only welcome that. Just to give some context to the size and scale of what we're talking about, so Fidelity have about 70,000 employees over 13 regional sites worldwide, and 20,000 of those are working in the technology sector. So I'm not going to bother going through the agenda with you, I'm just going to get straight stuck into it. So when we started this journey, of course, we had data centers. So 12 years ago when I started in Fidelity, we had multiple data centers, which of course we outgrew and had to move to bigger data centers because we're constantly growing. It was, not sustainable to be able to keep going that direction. And we have an awful lot of critical applications that require redundancy and allow us to be able to scale, but to be able to keep, the resiliency within those critical apps. And we have a lot of applications that have the same sort of patterns, where we have an awful lot of traffic. I suppose we have them built out on-prem to be able to service peak load, but you don't always have peak load 24/7, 365. So take a trading application that we might support, at market open or at market close, we would need to be able to service the peak load at that time. But in the evenings or the weekends, those servers on-prem were doing absolutely nothing. And then you'd have redundant servers to take over from those servers just in case there was ever an event. So there's a huge amount of waste from that on-prem presence. So cloud makes an awful lot of sense for those applications. And I know I'm talking about a trading application, but if you think about any application, even in our internal ones, they all had that same kind of ebbs and flows with traffic management. So it makes an awful lot of sense to move over to cloud to be able to take advantage of things like reducing cost, improving scalability and agility. And we certainly did that in a lot of cases. Where we wanted to start was really, talking about the applications and what sort of applications are suitable for the cloud. And as I mentioned earlier, we hope to have 95% of all of our applications in the cloud. So, there's very few applications that don't fall into that bucket. But we really looked at the beginning, we didn't put our most critical applications into the cloud first. We did want to get a certain amount of maturity within that space. So we worked on the most highly sensitive data we didn't put in there first, or our trading applications we didn't put in there first. We wanted our teams and our maturity in the cloud to grow before we went that direction. But there was lots of other areas. When we looked at it, we went with a multi-vendor, a multi-cloud vendor approach. And there's a lot of advantages to that. Like we heard earlier again from Liberty, you can compare them, you can use it for cost analysis, how each one, but it also gives our business units in Fidelity choices of where they want to go. Certain applications will naturally fall to one cloud provider or another. If we had a Microsoft hosted application or a C# application, it might go towards Azure. We might have different applications that might be more suited towards the services provided in another cloud provider. There's other factors that would determine what kind of cloud provider you go with as well, and one of them is costing. So depending on your application and how it works might depend which cloud provider you choose. And that can come down to the costing models of each of the cloud providers is slightly different. So if your application is very data intensive, or has a certain type of database that it wants, and the way it kind of costs per usage on that might determine on how you go. And there's lots of cost calculators out there readily available where once you kind of decide what your footprint in the cloud is going to look like for your application, you can cost it up before you even go down that journey to decide where it is. Other factors, and probably not so much now, but maybe 12 years ago, is the regions that your cloud provider are in. You may have customers or consumption coming from a certain area, and latency might be a factor with that. So you want to have a data center that's close to the usage of your application. So other things that you want to think about, I suppose, when getting started with your journey is your data transfer. And one thing we noticed at the very beginning is, I think again, one of the talks we heard earlier is about database choice and whatnot. We have lots of Oracle databases as well on-prem, but if we're moving to cloud and say we move to RDS, is how do you get that data and how does it transfer there? And that's not easy. It's complex, but there's lots of great tools out there like the data migration service in AWS allows you to be able to do that, but it certainly takes a lot of upfront planning. We also have a connection between our on-prem servers and our cloud providers. So you have to take into consideration how much data you're transferring and how much bandwidth you're actually going to take up as part of that. Again, talking about security, I think it's paramount, and we could talk about that all day, and we heard some great talks about that, so I'm not going to talk an awful lot about that. But once you're in the cloud, I think realizing the benefits within there, you really need to test and validate to ensure that you're actually getting the benefits that you think you're going to get once you're there. And I think that's really, really important. Cutovers and deployments, I think it's really important that you plan those ahead of time to make sure that you step into it to gain your confidence level. We would have had high-frequency trading applications, which we would have stepped in, maybe 25% traffic first, 50% traffic, and over a week or a month, we would go full in 100% cloud. To be able to be sure, because sometimes there might be things that you may need to revert back, so having that rollback plan is really important as well. And again, reiterating some of the points we heard earlier about monitoring and optimizing, once you're in, you're not finished from a cost perspective. New services are being released from our cloud providers every single day of the week. It's really, really important that we look at what we have and we, change it if there's a new service or a new feature that we can actually take advantage of after time. One thing that I suppose, if I was to reiterate one point on this, is that although we're very aggressively going towards the cloud, we didn't lift and shift anything. We changed. We had to re-architect. To be able to use the advantage and take advantage of all the services in the cloud, you have to re-architect your apps to be able to do that. I think that's fundamental. We've lots of different architectures that we use, and I'm not here to compare or contrast. Again, could be a whole session on that, but one we went towards lately is serverless, and we're just starting our journey on that. And although we're talking about migrating a lot from on-prem to cloud, we're actually on our journey now where we actually have some cloud-to-cloud migrations happening, and one of those is within the serverless space, where we're looking at moving some of our Java apps that are in EKS and moving them into the serverless space. And it's really important. I think some of the points made earlier about the advantages and disadvantages of serverless, there's a huge amount of advantages we see so far. One thing we found from our learnings from our other paths going to cloud was to make sure that we had a paved path for our serverless to make it really easy. Again, if I'm just to kind of dive into one point on that, I think it takes a long time to get I suppose, to get something working on serverless takes no time at all, and that's the real benefit of it. But to get it production ready, it takes quite a significant amount of time, and you need to give the teams time to be able to do that. We heard about the well-architected framework. That's really important, but that takes a long time to implement. So having your fully automated CI/CD, having your performance tests built in, having all that in your CI/CD pipeline, being able to click and make a change into your repo and have that go straight to production, and having all that taken care of by your pipelines, having your observability in place, all that can take weeks or months to actually get ready. So for teams working in that space, you need to give them the time to be able to discover, innovate, and learn, to be able to get those patterns in place up front. Then once they're able to do that, you'll actually reap the benefits from other migrations that come in behind that once that initial kind of work is done. And we've seen that on an initial project, which took 6 or 8 months to get a first endpoint of an API migrated to serverless. But the second one took 2 weeks, and the third one took half a week. The last thing I want to cover is just on culture and the changes I've seen, I suppose, over the last 6 years. We work in pizza teams in the Spotify model. We've 8 to 12 people, fully autonomous teams. They're full DevOps. We didn't start there. We started with developers who just developed, and we started with engineers who just engineered. And we do have teams built off DevOps engineers now who look at the whole picture from beginning to end, from their local environment to their observability to their pipelines and the development and everything in between. But that takes time to build out those teams. That doesn't happen overnight. The most important trait that we look for people coming in, and we have a huge amount of people coming in, is the continuous learning mindset. It's really, really important. This stuff moves so quickly. Public cloud moves so quickly. The technologies are moving so quickly. It's really important that we find people that can learn really quickly and are really invested in wanting to learn. And from the companies that we're in, it's really important that we make time for developers and for engineers to be able to have the time to learn. It's not an add-on to their role. It should be part of their role. I will leave it at that. And any questions where you want to dive in any deeper, thank you very much.
That's great, Alan and John. Thank you very much. Hopefully that's helped set the scene. I think, a really interesting set of experiences there. And we've heard a lot of talk today about the different services, how in Fidelity you started with a more traditional virtual server approach, and now you're migrating to serverless. So maybe just to kick things off, and I encourage people to get their questions ready, how would you sort of weigh up the approaches? And if you were starting out, how do you choose? Do I go a traditional virtual server container approach? Do I start with serverless? And then what's the impact of that on my security strategy? Any thoughts on that? John, you want to kick off? Or
Yeah, well, I suppose in our experience with our clients, and indeed our own experience, is start small is always the advice, because of the experience you have in the team, to be able to deal with a production workload that's gone into the cloud. Because it's not only a different set of thinking, it's a different set of tools as well that's required. So start small, because even if and be prepared, and we've heard it already, to learn fast and fail fast. To fail fast and learn from it.
Yep.
So starting small. And that's typically not with serverless. That's great for developers testing out and doing some POCs and things like that. But something like taking an application off a VM or a set of VMs that's maybe not in heavy usage, and deploy that as a platform as a service type service with a platform as a service type database is a perfect example of where we see clients turn.
Interesting. That almost seems counterintuitive, in terms of serverless seems like the easy way to get started, but I guess it also depends on the starting point. I think one of the things that you mentioned, Alan, was that you didn't do the lift and shift, that you really had to design to optimize to get the benefit. So I guess that may impact where you start as well in the approach. Nick, any thoughts?
Yeah, just from the experience of the ARTA, the aviation project I did, we were a greenfield site, effectively building a brand new application from scratch. We went serverless from day one, for better or for worse. Right. And one of the biggest drivers was cost. It was, we were taking data from airlines, cargo data that was coming in from airlines, and basically providing a dashboard so airlines could then see what's happening globally with cargo. That was the gist of it. So we had data coming in, we had a serverless architecture to process that data, and then we had a serverless architecture providing APIs for the dashboard. And the best thing about it was the bill. Yeah. Our Amazon bill was, what was it? It was less than $20 a month. Yeah. So that was quite attractive. The unfortunate thing is we needed a firewall for all our Lambdas to go through and everything, and that put the bill up to $220 a month. But the cost was quite amazing. The cost saving and the simplicity of to build it that way was quite compelling. So
that's fascinating and interesting that the security adds such a bill.
Added a massive and complexity as well.
Indeed. So what about the audience? Any questions? People have any thoughts on the serverless versus the non-serverless approach? What's top of mind for folks? Any questions in the audience? You're all at the end of a long day, so let's bring up the energy. I see a question over there. Do we have a mic in the room? If not, maybe you could just stand up and speak loudly.
So you might have the old application, which is a traditional application, right? And you have a customer on that. So at the same time, you are developing the serverless application. So what's your approach moving towards cloud native and bringing that old customer to the new environments?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and indeed it probably does depend on where you start from. We just heard two interesting opinions from the panel in terms of, in some cases it makes sense to start by just moving, almost a lift and shift. In other cases, you're redesigning. I think in our experience, one of the experiences we would have had is migrating certain services and doing more of a lift and shift, but then also coming to regret it, to be honest. I think, Alan talked about this a lot in terms of the benefits. If you're really trying to get that scalability, you want that elasticity of the cloud, then you have to design for that. Because when you're designing an on-prem product, it's typically designed for that high watermark. And lift and shifting that to the cloud, I think in our experience, isn't necessarily the best way to go. But it's a balance, because you're probably going to have some commercial pressures where a lift and shift is quicker versus a re-architect. So personally, I think one of the things I've seen is that what a lot of the speakers actually talked about is this is a journey. So you've got to figure out where to start, and you've got to be prepared to evolve from there. But I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel what your thoughts are.
Yeah, we made some, I suppose, at the beginning of the cloud journey, we made some decisions to, I won't say force people down the best practices route, but I suppose in hindsight it was. Something as simple as, we heard about clicky earlier on in the console and whatnot. Like at the beginning, we still don't. There's no console access in our production or non-production environments to ensure that people are using everything as code, not to go in to stop people going in to do that change. So it's all fine knowing who made the change, but we'd rather not even have to go down that route. And at first, that's a bit daunting that you can't go in and do that, but it does mean that you have to put in the upfront work to be able to do that re-architecture. Have your hardware as code, have your software as code. Do things like, how will I do, we talked about EC2s and rehydrating images and patching and all that. You can't do that manually with that sort of setup. And it's a very simple measure, but it's very effective to be able to do that. So that's just one example of how we kind of, I hate to use the word enforce, but definitely highly encouraged.
Yeah. Other thoughts from the panel or more questions?
We've seen, we've seen some of and it's been mentioned here a few times already this evening or this afternoon, is the change in the mindset and then preparing your teams for that change as well and investing in that, because it's all well and good, coming up with the other cost benefit of moving to the cloud, but that can put a lot of pressure on teams who are responsible for doing that and say achieving some of them cost optimizations that we say are there as low-hanging fruit, but there's a huge change for the team and how they so there's an investment in upskilling teams to be able to cope with that and rethinking your operating model around that as well.
Other questions from the audience? Question at the front here.
Thanks. I just had a question. You mentioned there, obviously, about investing in teams in terms of helping them upskill to prepare for the fast-changing environment and to adequately be able to do their jobs. Have you ever, but obviously there might be a challenge in terms of people resisting that, and obviously as humans we naturally don't like change. Do you have any, I suppose, advice for organisations that are struggling with a workforce, they're not buying into it and that don't want to invest in the learning and like that change their mindset? So we come across a lot, and it's all about awareness and communication. Like what's in it for me is the question, right? So why should someone change is really the nub of the question when you get underneath is like, why should I and what's the purpose of doing it? So if you give a top-down directive and say, I just want you to do this, you're going to come up against resistance. So even if it's well-intended, but if somebody's job now is changing or elements of their job role is changing, they've got to understand why they've got to get on board. And that can be forgotten. And if you leave that part out, you're going to get resistance by it in teams, or you're still going to have that lack of collaboration between the teams that you felt were now going to start playing ball with each other. And that's where it breaks down. It's never the tools, technologies. So if you invest in that training and the why part, you'll get a better outcome. Not guaranteed, but almost a better outcome.
Yeah, I think also, the cloud opens up so many more possibilities. So you really have to sell the benefits internally. I mean, we do see it sometimes that people have invested in that data center and that on-prem application. And that, that's their baby. They don't want to let it go.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think the cloud opens up so many more applications. This morning's session was all about AI and, the power of analytics and bringing AI to that. Some of the speakers today talked about it. Not to mention just the skill set. I think the cloud skill set is a very valuable skill set. So hopefully, we can encourage people to start learning these skills through, as John said, really selling them on the benefits.
There is actually something called
Microsoft
have something, Microsoft and Amazon have something called the Cloud Adoption Framework. And I've looked at the Microsoft one in quite some detail for a couple of different customers, and it addresses your question in the adoption of the cloud. If you look at the framework, a big part of it is, in fact, there is a whole section devoted to how job roles change. So if you're looking to move to the cloud, almost before you start the communication, you just look at that adoption framework and think, what do we need what skills do we need in place? Where are the gaps? UEDA, by the way, do training. But where are the gaps? Where are the gaps in the skills? Where will we need to make those adjustments? It's worth a look. Cloud Adoption Framework just takes you through that.
Yeah, we make it as part of the expectation of your role. It's not just delivery, and I think we make that very clear as well, that delivery is only one part of your role. We talk about 4 pillars in work. Your delivery is one thing, but your personal development is another quarter of your role. Your impact and your influence. So it makes that learning culture isn't just, as I said earlier, an extra part. It's something that's actually it's an expectation that you are constantly learning. And as I said, you have to make space for that as well. It's not just, you can't expect people to do it on the side or in the evenings or in the weekends.
Yeah. All right, we've got time for some more questions.
Yeah.
Question over there.
Hi, I have a quick question there on the aviation application that you mentioned earlier. So you mentioned you went straight from on-prem to the cloud and straight to serverless. And I'm just wondering, first of all, what did that look like? Did that look like, is it a compute environment with a GUI and serverless jobs running all the grunt work of the application? And then how long did that take for your teams to build that out? So if you're comparing it to an approach where you're deploying to VMs to compute first and then to serverless, would you do it again? Would you go straight to serverless, or would you go through the VM route where you I guess a slower upskill path?
No, that's a good question. I would go straight to serverless again. I think we did the right thing. I think it's based on experience with UEDA. We've built out a whole system for managing our students' infrastructure, and that all runs on serverless. So I was bringing that sort of experience of building out a serverless application and seeing it work successfully, and then looking at the requirements, because not everything can be serverless, but looking at the requirements of this particular project, it was just ticking all the serverless boxes. It was going to be very cost effective. It wasn't a massive use. There's not hundreds of thousands of cargo people out there in the world who care. It's a fairly small user base, so it's not going to be under massive traffic load. It's ad hoc. It's the data isn't ridiculously enormous. It is big, but it's not that big. So it just lended itself because of the nature of the requirements. So the serverless was, to give you a bit more detail, just briefly, we had Python-based Lambda functions doing all the data processing and all that. And then for the APIs, the REST APIs for the React app, which is what we use for the front end, that was all done with .NET, simply because the team were fundamentally a .NET development team. So we used C# for that. And that worked really nicely because the startup time is really good for the latest .NET anyway, for serverless stuff. So, yeah.
So the skill set kind of just carried into the cloud there, really.
Say again, sorry?
The skill set from on-premise from your developers, they pretty much carried into the cloud with that, there's not a huge amount of time in learning.
Yeah, so this particular team that I was working with, I was kind of new to the team. I came in, I actually knew the guy who ran the company because he was a drummer in a band and I was the bass player. So that's how it happened, to be honest. That's how I ended up getting involved in it. And I was coming as the cloud person. They normally did monoliths, .NET monolithic application. So I just came in and said, and the requirement was to be a microservice architecture. So I did some of the, sort of training / architecting, just helping the team. But they were fine with it. They were, it worked well. It took about, I think you asked how long it took. It must have taken about a year, 18 months to get the thing all up and running.
Awesome. Okay, I think maybe the last question then. We did promise to get you folks out, so we'll work on that.
Basically, I just want to know the advice from the panel, for us, when we are deploying any application in the distributed computing in public cloud, the challenges we are facing, I can see a lot of company are moving towards multiple public cloud, like GCP, AWS, Azure. The challenges we have, learning those things, retaining the talent on place, and certifying our product on a lot of these clouds because of the customer demands. We need to build different. So, what is the learning the panel can advise, if we are moving towards that direction? So, what should we, take care so that we shouldn't face much challenges for multi-clouds section?
So it was a little bit difficult for me to hear, but let me try and interpret your question. Tell me whether I got it right. I think you were asking about, some of the speakers spoke about the benefit of multi-cloud, but then that presents a challenge, right? Because now I've got to learn multiple systems. It's already quite difficult to get these skills, to develop them. And I think maybe your question was like, what's the optimal approach and how can I help train people across one service to another and how difficult that might be?
Yeah, that's right.
So any thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, well, I suppose in our space, once one business unit or one group tend to go with one provider, they tend to stay with that. I think at the beginning of our journey, we had thought we would be able to do some sort of, primary and DR between cloud providers. To be honest with you, what tended to happen is people tended to go with one cloud provider as their preference. Now we're going back a little bit. We have some teams, like our database teams, that do work across both, and there are some databases out there that will work across both as well. So we're kind of going back a little bit to that, and that does provide a challenge, having to have both sets of skills, and it's probably one we're kind of coming back around to at the moment. But it does, I suppose, one thing we did internally, and we've quite a big user base of doing this, is actually that within cross-team learning, having to bring people that are working on similar problems together, because divergence in this space is very easy to happen with everything we do. Every team will solve the problem and come up with a different solution. And if what you end up with is I think there was one of your diagrams earlier with all the cables and everything, you end up with such a sprawl of different solutions around the place, and that leads to huge problems. So if you're asking about one of the biggest problems we've dealt with, that's probably it. And when we went down the serverless route, that's one thing we wanted to nip straight away from the very beginning, that we didn't have 10 teams doing serverless, but coming up with a different way. You talked about using Python. I know one of our first conversations, and probably the hardest one, was what language we were going to use when we went to serverless, because everybody wanted to use a different one. But no real good reason, just because I know it, or, this is what I'm comfortable with.
Great. Okay, so we'll close the Q&A there. I want to thank our panel for the questions. Hopefully we can be around a little bit, so if there's further questions, apologise we didn't have more time, but I'll hand back to Paddy to close this out.
Thanks, Eric. So with that, I'd just like to thank you, the audience, for sticking with us. Many of you, I think, have been through here the whole day, so I know this is tough work, so you get a special prize for hanging in there. To all of our speakers today, to Nick, to David, to Brian, Darren, Eric, John and Alan, thank you. It's been a really pleasure. It's been a pleasure to work with you guys. And today was, as I said at the very start, this is kind of our first venture into a cloud native pitch. There's been a lot of feedback from it so far, and it's been good. So we do intend within the ITAC framework to create a forum in this context where we can kind of drill down the specific areas into the future. So the end of the beginning, I suppose, is the way we should close the meeting, or the event. So thank you very much.